Hi, my name is John Williamson, and today I want to welcome you to our second Holistic Health and Education Forum. Now, the reason for this forum is to look at what has been going on around us in our individual lives as we try to keep healthy during this COVID-19 pandemic, with our hand washing, donning of facial masks, and for some people, face shields, and then wet gowns. And then also to look at our situation as members of a family unit or a household, depending on what the situation may be. If you are co-sharing with others who may not be members of your family. And then to look at how this COVID-19 has affected us as a community, and then nationally and globally. Now, I'm not going to address this from a healthcare perspective, which is what I would usually do. But on this occasion, I want to look at it from a more holistic perspective. By that, I mean, I want us to look at it as a multi-dimensional, multi-professional beings. So I want to begin with some definitions. What do I mean by holistic? Now, I mean consisting of and being a part of a whole being, a human whole being. So I would ask you this question. How would you define yourself as a human person? Perhaps you define yourself as somebody who has a job, who is part of a family, who is of a particular gender, who belongs to an ethnic group, or who is just a citizen of the world. You probably define yourself in terms of social constructs, how society perceives you, or you define yourself in terms of your identity within your family, or you define yourself in terms of your goals, aspirations, etc. Now, whatever your definition of what it means to be whole as a person, I want you to think of one word, and that is decision making, decisions. And how does this relate to health and education? How does this relate to COVID-19? Well, I'll tell you what, I believe it relates to COVID-19. We've all been first-hand witnesses of how the decision making that has taken place in government, in our workplaces, how decision making has shaped our lives during the last several months. So we've had people who we know to have a certain expertise, clinical expertise, scientific expertise, who have made policy decisions, and the rest of us have been affected by these decisions. And so one of the things we realize is those decisions are important. Now, some of those decisions we would admit were not very well informed decisions. Some of them were not very reflective decisions. And some of those decisions were just big mistakes. Now, what we need to look at is, you could say, because people weren't sure about what to do, because we didn't know enough about this condition, you could argue that there is no point in making policy decisions. Make sure that you do your homework. If you are a policymaker, make sure you really understand what is at stake before you make a decision. I mean, that is one way of looking at a situation. So moving it away from, the national level of policy decision makers, I want us to bring this onto a very personal level. Do we sometimes face scenarios or situations when we are being pushed to make decisions, although we do not have all the information with which to make those decisions? Have you ever faced a challenge, a situation where you had to make a decision and yet you didn't know enough about the situation? You didn't know enough about the discipline. You didn't know enough to make a decision. I have a lot of times. And I just want to share a few insights that I learned several years ago. In fact, I learned this in the year 2000, 2001. And so this is what I learned. I learned that decision is the necessary prerequisite for facing the reality of any situation. You can talk about a situation that you are faced with. You can dream about things being better, but the crux of it is making a decision. Until you've made a decision, you are not being realistic. You are not actually confronting the reality of a situation. So somebody is going to ask, you might ask that question: how can I make a decision when I have fears? How can I make a decision when, I'm still excited? I need to settle down. I need to be in a good place, in a mind space, a good mind space, in order to make a decision. Okay. So what I'll add to this is, in addition to the statement that to face the reality of a situation, you've got to make a decision, I would also say that worst case scenarios don't mean anything. Ideal situations, potential, doesn't mean anything until we have actually made a decision. So you don't have good performers, you don't have underachievers, you only have people who have made a decision. I want to say that again. There's nothing like a good performer. There's nothing like an underachiever. You only have people who have made decisions. Everything else to do with your ability to achieve something, your IQ, your EQ, means nothing until you have made a decision. Okay, so now I'm at the place where I'm ready to make a decision. So I want to make a decision like maybe start a new project. I want to make a decision like begin on, go back to university or start studying, enroll on a course. I want to do these things. So how do I proceed? How do I make sure that I execute this decision-making process? How do I execute it efficiently? I'll give you another word. It's called structure. So structure is another word for design. So you can hear about design, and design is a more appealing terminology. But what design actually means is structure. So you've got a decision, you've made a decision to do something. You've got to put a design to it. It starts with a design. It starts with a structure. And I just want to put something there. Sometimes people feel the lack of resources, the challenge based on what is expected means that they just quit on the situation. They just decide to do nothing. Now, if you decide to do nothing, or you keep putting off decisions, it's like quitting, okay? So you can either quit by doing nothing, or you can quit by putting off the decision. So either way, you're in the same category. You're quitting, but if you keep putting it off. It's just that when you put it off, you are quitting on a marathon scale. Your ultimate goal is to quit, but you are quitting in measures. However, if you just quit outright, you're still quitting, but as a sprinter. So we're talking about design, putting structure or design to the decision making. Well, one of the ways to look at a subject is to rule out what it isn't. So, for example, if I want to know what its decision, I want to make sure that I am under no illusions that other things I do, which I might think is being decisive, I need to make sure that I clear out all the bits that are not decision. And that's what a design, a structure does. So you have decided to do something. You have decided to enroll on a course. You have decided to go along with a plan or a project. And so the design makes sure that you regulate your thoughts, you regulate the management of your time, you regulate the use of your resources. And so you set boundaries. That's what design does. You set boundaries. So setting boundaries doesn't just mean you're just going to do something different and anything at all, and ultimately you get to where you want to go. That's not what it means. Design just means you identify where you are now and you identify where you want to go. This is what the design, these are some of the components of the structure. It's got to have a starting point and it's got to have an objective. This is what structure is, a starting point and an objective. And so with design, you just have to make sure that your starting point and your end point or your destination are linked by transitional modes, okay? Transitional modes. So that in a nutshell should form the component of a good design, of a good structure. So let's start with somebody, and I'll call her Sarita. So Sarita graduated with honors from a university school of business and information technology. So she landed a first job in a company called AMAC Logistics, a multinational company with several customers out beyond Europe in many continents, including the Pacific, the Far East. And she spoke Mandarin. She was very fluent in Punjabi and, by the way, Mandarin Chinese. And Punjabi is very widely spoken in the continents of India and very close by. So she started this job, and in the first weeks at a job, she had to undergo a 2-week induction program. Now, she was allowed to self-direct. She was allowed to read some materials, and if she had any questions, she'd go to the prospective supervisor. And so, okay, after the 2 weeks, she was expected to start. She was thrown at the deep end, and she was expected to start. But you know what? By the second week, Sarita was feeling quite desperate. And she kind of felt that she was being set up to fail. So I am going to use a model about how she was able to address her inadequacy. So that's a decision-making model I'm going to take you through. Now, when Sarita was asked to use that model, obviously, anything was better than just dwelling incessantly on her fears. So she wanted some diversion, and this is the model. We'll call it the hi-fi model. So how does Sarita apply the hi-fi model to the challenge she was facing? That she was supposed to start working at a job after a 2-week induction program. And by the end of the 2 weeks, she was feeling really inadequate, and she felt like she was being set up to fail. Now, the first thing, remember I said the first thing about decision making, because to confront the reality of any situation, you must make a decision. Well, she didn't feel like she knew enough to make any decision. And so rather than making a decision, she wanted to read some more. She wanted to be given a more extended time for training. No. So we are going to look at the root of Sarita's problem. So we'll start with a problem or situational analysis. Sarita has got to make a decision. And you know what? Her problems of feeling inadequate are just a reflection of your problem and my problem. So, you know what? I started by talking about how we saw decision-making played out during the COVID-19 crunch, who were making decisions, and some of the decisions were full of mistakes and policy mistakes, and a lot of people died, and a lot of people felt, do you know what? Why make these decisions when you are not adequately informed? I would say make a decision not because you're the best person at handling any given situation, but making a decision is number one step towards confronting the reality of any situation. Decision making, is the number one step in confronting the reality of any situation. Don't put off decision making just because you have not read enough, just because you don't have enough information. Start making decisions, okay? Because decision making is the number one step towards confronting the reality of any situation. Indecisiveness is the same as quitting. Procrastination is the same as quitting, but quitting on a marathon scale. Giving up is quitting on a sprinter scale, okay? So when Sarita was faced with that situation, the reality check is, yes, she's feeling inadequate, but she needed to make a decision. Okay, so that's the first thing about the hi-fi model. She needed to make a decision. So what was the kind of decision that she could make? I mean, should people go ahead and make a decision which is going to cost lives? That's one of the things you want to ask. Isn't there anything like informed decision making? And so I'm going to go into how to go about decision making. Now, first of all, in order to make a good decision, in order to begin with decision making, you need self-awareness. I want to say that again. You need self-awareness. You need to be aware of who you are coming from, who you are in respect to that situation. You need to understand your relationship outside that situation. For example, are you the brain? Are you an expert? No. Good. That's one good self-awareness. I'm not the expert in that situation. Number two, are you the person responsible for getting somebody who is more knowledgeable, for getting the expertise? Yes. Number three, will you improve things by drawing the attention of the person who has hired you, by drawing the attention of this reality? Now look, I don't know enough about the situation to make the right decision. I know enough to communicate to the person who's hired me, who's put me in this situation, that this is the kind of person who can do the job. Okay, so there are two things here: self-awareness. What is self-awareness? Know your limitations, but not stopping at your limitations. Being aware of what the solution looks like, having an idea, an ideal of the solution. That's what it's in. So that's what we call situation. That's number one, situation analysis. Now, the fact that I can have a problem doesn't mean I walk away. The fact that I don't have the answer to your challenge doesn't mean I walk away. But I need to find out what the answer looks like. Because if I can have some idea, and even if it's a little idea of what the answer looks like, I will be in a position to headhunt, to look for, to link you to the person who has that expertise. That is situational analysis. Okay, the other thing is, what about, what are the rules, the principles governing this situation, the solution of this problem? And you know, that's where a lot of people fail. So they fail in this bit where, first of all, they are confused about whether they have the answer. They are not self-aware enough to know that, look, I just do not have the answer. Usually they see the mark of the dollar sign or the pound sterling sign, the salary attached to a position, a role, and that becomes the driving force. So they accept a certain responsibility, they accept it, they embrace it without being honest, without being self-aware about it, to say, look, I cannot do this. The best I can do in this situation is to get somebody who is able to do it, and this is whom I think would be able to do it. You know, years ago, that was 1999, in fact, I went to a youth for people with alcohol dependency, and they also had some mental health issues. And they were looking to hire somebody to manage the unit somewhere in London. And I knew that I didn't have the expertise because my background is general adult nursing and very limited management experience by that time. I knew I didn't have the expertise. And I also had a good idea what the expertise would look like. So I didn't just go into this. I went for the meeting, I went for the interview because I knew that I could offer the director, the board of directors, a good idea of the kind of expertise they were looking for. I also knew enough about not being the right person. Well, in a nutshell, when I described to them what that expertise looked like, they voted unanimously to hire me to demonstrate that. Well, if I was saying that this is what you need to do, this is what the person needs to do, then obviously I had to now think about the next stage. Would I be able to put a team together on a transitional period to resolve that issue? And I knew I would be able to do that, but only for a limited period. So to demonstrate, to bring some stability to that unit. Because in a period of 2 years, I think 2 or 3 years, they had lost 4 managers, one after the other. And I thought, okay, in a couple of months, about 6 months, I could bring some stability to the place. So that's what I did. In fact, it's actually what gave birth to this model I'm talking about, the hi-fi model. So like Sarita that I was talking about, I knew that I didn't have the answer. I didn't have enough time to induct myself to the role. But unlike Sarita, I didn't allow myself to become overwhelmed. What I did was I reached out for multidisciplinary members of the team, community mental health professionals, social workers, occasionally the police. I reached out for people who could help me steer the ship, which was being rocked, being buffeted by the storm. So within 6 months, this unit of me managing it, provisionally managing it, this unit had been stabilized. And the board of directors decided that they wanted me to assume the role on a permanent basis. Now, I knew better than that. I knew that in the long term, even the medium term, this unit needed somebody who had more expertise than I did. All I was doing was I was situation analyzing. And so after 12 months, I resigned with a successful track record. But I was on the verge of burnout because I knew that I was coming close to working beyond my expertise. But I brought this because of the second principle, which is knowing my boundaries, standard setting. Principle number 1 is being self-aware enough to know that you are not the answer person, but not stopping at that. Taking it to the next stage, caring about the situation, caring about the solution enough to understand it, to learn to research what the ideal solution would look like. Principle number 2, boundaries. Don't be overwhelmed by the compliments and the praise. Yes, I received a lot of praise. At that time, we had the Commission for Social Care Inspection. And they said, you know what, you have helped this place so far. We are lifting the blacklist that had been existing before you came on the scene. And so I was like, the expert, the genius, everybody thought I could not do anything wrong. But I knew that one of the strengths of my approach was I had identified by self-awareness my own limitations, and I also had a clear vision of what the ideal solution would look like. Okay, let's go to number 3 now. So by this stage, I had self-discipline, put boundaries of myself. I am not going to be managing this unit beyond 1 year, by which time I would have stabilized the place, proven that it can be done, and recommended somebody who would be more suited on a long-term basis to manage this unit. So the third principle I want to give you is leadership skills are necessary. Now, there are lots of people who go into a role with the ability to manage people, the ability to control people. But what leadership is influence. Now, whereas managing is a vital skill when you've decided the assets, because management is just asset management. You've just decided this is where we are. Now, leadership, on the other hand, is influence, is inspiration. You are guiding a team into a vision which isn't always very clear. So I want to explain the difference. With management, the assets are very, very definable. Everybody can see it, okay? There is a structure, it's already in place, and it calls for managers. Managers are the status quo. You keep the status quo from deteriorating. But you don't just need management, you need leadership when things are not clear. And back to our person, Sarita, she had been given a job and she had been given 2-week induction, and she was expected to manage her induction, self-direct her induction. And she was expected to be so self-motivated that she was going to look at the material and just come back to her supervisor if she had any questions. So you could say, in a way, she was coming into this job situation as somebody who was self-training. So they were not relying, the company was not relying on what they were going to, information that she was going to garner for those 2 weeks. They were relying on what she brought into the role, who she was. And so they were relying on something more than the 2 weeks. And that is where leadership comes in. Leadership is influence, it's innate. Leadership is not just a case of whether you've got an MBA, you've got a PhD, what your qualifications are. That is not, leadership is not just something like that. Leadership is a lot more. I would stop this because I don't want it to go a bit longer. But when we have another opportunity, I would actually continue. So thank you for tuning in to our Holistic Health and Education Forum. It wasn't exactly about health, but it's just mentioning something which is a vital ingredient in the healthcare sector and in the education sector, which is decision making. Thank you.